After the passing of the Declaration of Independence, all effort was placed on trying to win this war. And let's remember that Washington was put into charge of the Continental Army. But the Continental Army was not necessarily an army. It was more a collection of part time volunteer militias that were contracted to fight for just 1 year. About 230 soldiers served in the Continental Army. 145 of them served in those local militias. And those local militias, like I mentioned, were contracted for about a year. Most of them were very young. They had very little money or property themselves. They got very little pay. And finding and keeping dedicated soldiers was definitely a challenge. The very wealthy usually paid off slaves or apprentices or others to be able to serve in their place. So the Continental Army in itself at the beginning of the war was really this makeshift put together army. And in comparison to the British, which was the most powerful empire in the world, and they had a very well trained professional army, they were rulers of this huge empire. So the sides were very different, very uneven, and the British were really pretty certain that they were going to win this war in the end. Now, women also played their part in the role in the war as well. They ran businesses and farms while the men were away at the war. They helped by raising money for supplies or by making clothing. Some of them served as messengers or nurses and spies within the war itself. Molly Pitcher was one that served by providing water for the soldiers, and at times she would also kind of just gun ho and get together and try to load the cannons and everything, whatever she could do. So women did play an active role even out in the war front itself. Some dressed up as men and fought in order to participate in the war as well. Now, African Americans also were not far behind in the war effort. At first, slaves were not allowed to serve in the army, but soon after, the British began allowing African Americans to serve in exchange for their freedom. And so, because of that, after a while, Washington decided that he was going to do the same for the Continental Army, and soon they began allowing African Americans to serve, and after a period of time, many of them were granted their freedom. By the end of the war, pretty much every single one of the states, except for South Carolina, included African Americans in their troops. One of the most well known all African American troops was the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which was made up of all African American slaves and were one of the most successful regiments within the American Revolution. So each of these groups played an important role within the war front itself and in support of the war.